Hi guys, welcome back. So right now we're going to put together the LCD panel. So for this you need the clear bag marked LCD. You're going to need the gray cable out of your cables bag. This is also going to be marked LCD on both sides. The red, this is going to be packaged together in your metal parts box. There's going to be two small 90-degree brackets and an LCD holder. You're also going to need the brown box, which in it's going to have your Duet Wi-Fi antenna and your LCD screen. So, not to overstate the obvious, but the screen in this state is pretty fragile. So try not to torque it or vibrate it too much. We'll get it mounted up in our holder, and it will end up being much better, much more rigid at that point. So once we open up our panel here, the only connector on the back of this that you have to be worried about is this one down here in the corner. This is the one that takes the gray cable, which we're going to hook into momentarily. We're going to do a little bit of prep work on it first. So we need 4 M3 nuts, and we need 4 of the 5mm spacers, the brass spacers. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to put one of the brass spacers through the front, and we're going to spin on one of our 3mm nuts in the back. And we're going to do that in all 4 corners. Now once you have all 4 of them on, I just grab a pair of needle nose pliers. I keep my finger on the back of the brass spacer, and I just give that nut a little snug up turn. You don't want to tighten it down too much, but you just want to make sure your brass spacer is not going to start to spin as you're putting your screws in through the front. At this point, peel the clear protective film off your screen, because it will be almost impossible to get it off afterwards. So at this point, grab your cable. Doesn't matter which end, both ends are reversible. This cable is keyed, so it will only go in one way. There's 2 ridges on the back. They're going to go against the flat portion of the connector. Push it down onto the connector, and then you just have to manage the rest of this install with the cable connected. So your screen is going to be mounted in this orientation on the front of the machine. Same as your 2 buttons and your speaker go to the right side in the box. So make sure the orientation of everything is correct. I support the screen from the back. Move my screws out of the way for a moment. I support my screen in the back, and I just simply lower on the red cover, the mounting bracket. That way you're supporting the screen, and the bracket is just going to lay in place where it needs to be. You can start your 4 screws. And then just tighten them down. Now, there are some issues with these LCD panels that if you tighten these screws down too much, you actually deform the board, and the digitizer on the front of it doesn't work properly. So when you're doing this, you're just snugging it up so that it doesn't move and it's not loose. You don't have to really crank these down hard. So this is what you're going to be left with: screen, bracket with your cable in the back. And now we're going to move over and start mounting this on our machine. Now that we're over on the Modix machine, I've just placed these 2 T-nuts inside the brackets here. These T-nuts are going to go in with the PEM nuts sticking out. So this one is going to go in this way, and the bottom one is going to go in that way. So the LCD panel is held on with only 2 screws, one from the right side and one from the bottom. So getting ready for that, let's get these bolted into place. So remember at this point that we have our gray cable already attached. So we're going to feed that through the slotted hole here in the frame first. Keep one hand on your screen all the time. I'm just going to hang this cable out over the back so it's out of my way. Now, the easiest way I found to do these screws, because especially the bottom one can be a little tight, I actually put the bottom one in first. Once the bottom one's in a couple of turns, you should be able to line up the side one here a little easier. So we'll set this cable out of the way for right now. We will get into cable routing and management very shortly. But for right now, I'm going to tuck this inside of the frame, and I'm just going to leave it hanging over the extrusion. So finishing up our decorator panels on the front, we've got this on its wheels right now, so I can move it around a little easier. We're actually going to move to the bottom. We're going to put the front decorator panel on, and then we're going to come back and we're going to start into some cable management. All right, so you'll notice now we're going to go do this bottom panel in the front. It's part of the decor panels, or the decorative panels for the Modix. So you notice there is a slight taper in the middle. So this is the bottom, this is your top. The second 2040 extrusion with the red plates on the end, I've pre-installed for you because you've already seen me install it at the top. The only difference down here is the screws into the 2040 is an M5x8. The bolts everywhere else in the extrusion are an M5x12. So I'm going to start with the M8s. Now, in this cavity here is where we will actually bolt the control box for our heater bed. So the heater bed on the Modix is not controlled by the Duet Wi-Fi. It actually has its own separate independent controller that you can turn on or off, and it will not throw an error if you turn the bed off while you're printing. So this is its own control box. This will be mounted in here. I'm not going to do it currently, only for one reason. If I mount this in right now, I have to take it out again before I put the lower panel in for the enclosure. As I mentioned earlier in the video, we do have the full enclosure kit ordered for this one. So you will see there's a base plate that's going to go in here first. Once the base plate goes in, then I'll mount the control box into the front of the machine. Let's take a pause here for a moment, and we'll be right back with the next step. So all of the Modix enclosures on the V3s, and I'm assuming above, will now come with these aluminum metal composite panels. The panels are basically aluminum on 2 sides with a composite material in the middle, which actually makes them very strong. When you go to install these, you can go ahead and peel back your coating altogether. It will peel off fairly easily. Try not to hit the corner of it, because again, because it's aluminum, it will bend if you happen to hit the corner a little too hard. Okay, so once you have it prepped this way, you can see which way it will fit inside the frame. And then in it will go. All of Modix's tolerances are very, very tight. It will fit snugly in between each bracket. I'm actually going to loosen the bolts on these brackets slightly just to center everything up and make sure that it lays down square. Once you get that in and straightened up, you're going to take your 4040 M5 T-nuts. Modix has built into their panels a slot right next to every hole. The slot is there so you can actually take the T-nut, drop it through the slot. You can use an Allen key, straighten it around inside the extrusion, push it under the hole, and simply drop your bolt straight in it. Every one of them will go the same way. So the bottom panel has 2 bolts per side. The ones at the front, you'll probably have to use a ball end because you'll have to come up underneath this extrusion on a little bit of an angle to get them. But once you get the 8 of those done, then we're actually going to move ahead and get the box installed. Once we have it released from its packaging. So this box has got your power switch for your single bed element and your temperature control switch here as well. Again, this runs completely independently from the Duet Wi-Fi. There is no feedback between this and the Duet Wi-Fi to let it know that the bed temperature is at or where it should be. So you'll have to monitor this independently. In order to get the control box open, there's 4 large plastic screws at the top. Again, Modix has done a very good job of whatever screws or connectors you need for each component is included with the component. So as you take these 4 large screws in the top off, take the top and lay it aside. And then when you look at the front of it again, there's 4 screws. These 4 screws are actually plastic. 4 plastic nuts on the back, and all they're for is to hold it onto that front decor panel. So let's just take these out. When you're down here with the control box, when you have a look at this heater wire, make sure that it lays nicely across the bottom of the machine. If you've got the box twisted over too many times, it might get a little knotted up. I try and keep it as even as I can to just kind of let it flake out properly. Once we get our control box laid in place, pop this through the front. So with them loosened up, it just gives me a little bit of extra play here in the front. Now get our switches in where they should be. Again, because these are plastic screws, you don't have to over tighten them. Okay, so now everything's on. We can go ahead and retighten up these bolts around the outside of the decor panel if you had to loosen them. I'm not going to slide this cover on yet until I've gone through my power testing and whatnot with it. But this is how everything else will go back together. Other than that, when we come back again, we're going to get into cable management and start getting all of our hot ends and parts all hooked up. So we're back and we're going to start doing some of the wiring hookups. So on this particular machine right now, we're only doing 1 print head. We are going to be doing a follow-up video adding a 2nd print head to this machine and what that process is through a Modix. Currently we are putting it together as a single head configuration machine. So if you have a 2-head or a dual print head machine, have a look at that 2nd video as well. It will take you through a little bit more of the process of getting the wiring done for the 2nd one. The process is exactly the same for both. You just have to make sure all your wiring is marked H1 for heater 1, H0 for heater 0. Heater 0 is extruder 0 or the first extruder, and so on for the thermistor, the heater, the extruder, fan motors, everything will be marked either 0 or 1. So that being said, our first wire here, which is labeled B, this one here has our extruder wire, BF1, which is blower fan 1. It has HF0, which is heater fan 0. There's a single wire here, which I believe is not in use. That is correct, it's marked P. There's another one here that is marked G, that is not in use. HF1, heater fan 1. And finally, the last one is BF0, which is blower fan 0. So when I set up the length of these wires, I'm going to have to lengthen this one a little bit because this extruder wire has to plug into the bottom of the extruder down here. You'll notice the one addition I have on here is this back bracket. I put it on in the middle of, on the side of one of the videos. This is simply a support bracket for the back of this assembly. Once you get the extruder head and everything mounted and you start getting your wiring done, insert this bracket because the wires are designed to come out this square hole in the back. So if I have a look at my B line, I have to bring this down so that it reaches here. So through the cable chain, you can actually push the wire up. All right, so I've discovered a little bit of a problem. Not a huge deal, it is fixable. So according to Modix's instructions, this drag chain support bar is supposed to be from the bottom of the bar to the top of the bottom rail, supposed to be 600 millimeters. 600 millimeters is the correct distance for this bar. However, it is sitting too low, so I'm using too much cable here and it's not allowing me to reach the extruder at the top. So I've temporarily bolted on the back panel that's going to be going on the back of this machine momentarily. So here's our limitations. This is the slot that these cables will feed into the machine through. So as long as this bar, I can move it up, but I have to be lower than this. So the top of this drag chain cannot be any higher than the bottom edge of this lip. So I'm going to go outside the directions a little bit. I'm going to move this drag chain up about half the distance that this is currently between here and up here. That way it will allow these cables to flow into the machine properly, still get caught by the drag chain, and give me enough space at the other end to be able to hook in all the rest of my wires up there. So just wanted to point out to you, sometimes there's a little bit of a difference in the instructions. I'm not sure what happened on this one. Usually the instructions themselves are very solid. In this particular case here, came a little short, but there is an easy enough workaround for it. So when you come back, I'm going to have this drag bar moved up, or the drag chain support bar. I'm going to have this moved up, and all I'm simply going to do is move these cables through the drag chain in order to give me some additional length up here. So moving ahead with the wiring for this machine, this plastic extrusion cover is your best friend. Just going to cut this open and show you what this is. They give you plenty. You don't have to be stingy with it. Just make sure everything is covered, and the major thing is make sure the wires are not going to move where you don't want them to move. So I'm going to keep a piece of this close on hand. I have here the wiring harness. It is marked XM, which is X-axis motor. So these cables are made, I believe they're probably made by Abus, either Abus or Modix, not sure yet, really. Basically what happens is you use your 1X motor output from the Duet board, and it splits into your dual stepper motors as required on the machine. So when we were doing this machine originally, we did the front wire connector up and the rear wire connector down, and now you'll see why. So when you plug in your front motor, when you're doing these motors, make sure you plug them in straight and square. I have gotten a couple of phone calls, and I am also guilty of it as well. Especially when you're working on the Z motors at the bottom, it's very easy to put that connector in slightly off square and possible to start bending pins on the stepper motors. So just when you're doing it, gentle, firm, make sure it clicks. Our motor wire next will come in here to the back, plug into the bottom of the rear stepper motor. This wire at this point will go straight into the control box at the very back. We'll deal with that in the next step. So when we're doing these motors, or the wiring, the wires are actually going to sit inside the channels for the extruded aluminum. Now, a couple of notes when you're doing this. When your wiring sits in here, make sure it's not going to be coming out and touching the ball screws, and make sure it's not going to get pinched in this cable, in any of your belts, or it's not going to get squeezed by your gantry as it's moving to the rear. So this one out of the LCD, it actually came out straight through the belts. So I'm going to untangle it from the belt. And to make sure that nothing touches, I'm going to bring it below the stepper motor and then up into the extrusion. So what we're left with is a wire that's held firmly in place below the stepper motor, so it's not going to run any risk of touching the belt on this side. It's going to come up inside of the channel, and then we're going to grab our plastic cover. This one should reach no problem, and simply push it into the slot as we feed our wires in. Now, if you find that your plastic cover is a little long, I think this one here should be okay, but I may have to snip just a little bit off. Get our LCD wire in the back, motor wire in the front. Yeah, this one here is just a touch long. Just going to clip about 1 inch off. Nothing's going to move, nothing's going to touch. And then when I put it in this side channel here, the little piece I cut off, I'm just going to use it here as a temporary hold, just to keep it where I want it. Put our LCD panel cable through, and that's it for LCD and x-gantry. Now, earlier in the process, I'm going to spin this a little bit here for you so you can see. A little earlier in the process, I did unplug the y-axis stepper motor. So I'm going to plug that back in again. So that's all of our motors in the top end hooked in. One last thing we can add in at this point as well. Let's pull that temporary one out for a second. Our x-axis end stop, I'm going to double check, x-axis end stop. The way I usually do these ones is I'll actually bring them over top of the motor, and I'll bring them down in the same channel as the LCD and the stepper motor cable. Again, I'll just put that little temporary one back in there to hold everything. Once we get it down this far, we can put that in our control box as well. So we're starting to collect a fair bit of wiring back here in our control panel at the back. That's fine, everything is labeled independently, so you will be able to find it again. Next step, we're going to do the Z motors at the bottom, and then we're going to do our initial fire up, and we'll get it up and running for the first time. All right, so at this stage, I've got the two Z motors on the right side of the machine already hooked up. I already have the cable ran through. The process is going to be exactly the same for both. I have ZLM, which is Z-axis left side motors. So again, these are very similar to the X. They have a Y cable, so it'll do two motors, and then there's a single connection into the Duet. Now, this is the part of the wiring that I was referring to. You've got to kind of get down a little cozy with it, but be very careful that you get your connections to your motors straight and square when you clip them in. So clip both motors in, and then I'll show you what to do with that extrusion cover. Okay. So I have a piece cut, sits roughly the length between the two red plates. Doesn't have to be perfect. So again, tuck your motor wire into the extrusion. Once you get it in place, you can press the extrusion or the cover in place. I'm basically putting it into this slot, but on the inside. You can't quite see it, unfortunately. But trust me, that's the way it works. So once we have our motors, once we have our wire back as far as this motor, bring the wire on the outside of the motor, and then you can bring it up through the little hole in the red plate in the back, where you'll notice I've already got the Z wire for the left side brought up. So we have both of them together. So once we get them in through here, we're going to put them into the extrusion channel at the very back. Use another cover to keep them in place. And then when you get up here to the mid-beam, you'll actually notice in the back of it, there's a small cutout on the back of the red bracket, which is actually going to allow you to bring the wiring straight up the inside of this rail, and it's not going to be affected by the back panel or anything moving inside the machine. Now, there we go. All right, so that gives me one Z motor. I should say one set. This gives me the other set. And both of them together. I'm going to tuck them back inside the extrusion. And I'm going to cut another small cover. And just use it to keep them managed right here at this location. Because once we get past this, we're going to bring them right inside the control box. The last wire we have here is the one for our Y-axis. That came out at some point. So we're going to bring this up, bring it up here, inside our control box, and that's another wire complete. YX top can go in here. So quick double check, make sure all your wires are in, tucked away. They're not going to hit anything that's moving. They're not going to lay on anything that's hot. And they look as neat as we can make them at this point in time. When you move the hot end out, you just want to make sure all your wiring is above the level of the nozzle itself. Where it's resting, even without zip ties or anything else on it, it's not going to want to hang down any lower than the nozzle. So this brings us to the end of mechanical setup. It brings us to the end of wiring, wiring management and setup. We'll probably do a little bit of additional cleanup just kind of as we're moving through the process. But at the next step that we're going to do now is we're going to tie everything into the control box here at the back. We're going to power this machine up. We're going to start bringing it through its first paces. At this point in time, you can do it now. I will be doing it very shortly, but we will add the PEI sheet onto our bed. Or in our case, we're going to be doing the flexible build plate on it. So at this point in time, while the frame is still open, you haven't got any panels or anything on, move forward and put the PEI sheet on. Again, I will do the flex build surface. I will add that in next, and then we'll continue to move. Thank you very much. All right, just making a quick change here in the back. The X limit switch, when I brought that down on this side of the stepper motor, it shortened my line up a little bit too much. So I'd actually have a very hard connection trying to plug it into the box. So I just moved it to your left side of the stepper motor and just tucked it back in with that little piece of covering back into the extruded aluminum. So basically everything that we need to hook into this is sitting right here. There's nothing else that we have to find or hook up to our machine. So the first thing I generally start with is the LCD panel. So as you pick up your wires, look at the ends of them. They're all clearly labeled. And when you find the LCD one, the LCD is going to come up on your left side and is going to plug into the very top connector on the left side, above the other one that looks the same but already has a connector in it, because some Modix does a fair bit of the pre-wiring for you. So those three major large cables, the A, B, and C cables, they're already hooked into the main board for you. So you don't have to worry about where those wires go. There is a complete pinout diagram in your installation manual online. It does signify for you each color and each location of every wire on the Duet board for the Modix. I do recommend that you double check that list. I've already double checked mine, so mine looks okay. But as we're going to go now, we're just going to start hooking in our motors and our end stops, and then we will be almost ready to power it up. So this is my Z motor, one of my Z motor lines. I usually loop this over the top of the Duet. These two connectors down here next to each other, these are our Z motors. So I just usually loop it over the top and then plug it into one of the connectors. It doesn't matter which one it plugs into, they're both going to be sent the same signal. I believe this is my other Z motor. Same configuration, you can lay it up around the box. And plug it into the Duet. Okay, next one is our X. So if we look here on the side of our machine, Z is on the bottom, Y is the second one up by itself, X is the third one up by itself. The one I have here in my hand is X, so that is going to go in on the top connector. Or sorry, I won't say top connector, the third connector from the bottom. This one here should be our Y motor, which is correct. That's going to go right in between, which is here. So the only thing we have left right now is our two end stops. There are two end stops, one is X, one is Y. There is a row of white connectors going down the middle of this board. Foregoing the bottom connector, which is slightly out of alignment, let's not count this bottom one. The second one from the bottom, or the last one in the straight row, is your Y, and the one directly above it is your X. So this is our Y connector. We'll verify this and plug it in on the appropriate pin block, which is here. And this is our X, which is going to go in directly above the Y. So for wiring, that is it. I'm going to pull out the power supply. We're going to plug it in here. I'm going to plug the power supply in. I'm going to leave this cover off for right now, just in case we have any troubleshooting to do. The power supply does come with a set of brackets that you can bolt it to the back of this machine so that it's not dragging around the floor or anything. I'm not going to use that right now because I still have the enclosure to put on. So I'm simply plugging this in to start doing some of the electronics testing. If there's any work to be done or anything needs to be repaired, it's easy enough to do now that the machine is completely open. Once everything passes its initial electronics checks, then I'm going to unplug the power supply, close this control box up, and move forward with the enclosure. All right, so we're ready for the initial fire up. I have everything plugged in. Once it's plugged in, the temperature will start to display on the heater control box down below. So this is a quick one. We'll just do this one real fast. Right now you can see it's currently set. It's currently at 23 degrees. The set point on it is 50. So if I simply hit the power switch on that bed, we're going to wait for a second or two, and we're going to watch this temperature start to increase. When the temperature comes up to within 5 degrees of its target, it's going to go into what they call a maintenance mode. So when this machine reaches 45 degrees, when the red numbers get to be 45, this power switch is going to start to flash about once every second. It's normal. It's basically saying, I'm close to my target, I'm just going to maintain what you requested of me. It flashes to tell you that it's operating. If you turn it off, the light still stays lit, and sometimes if you're kind of doing your check at the end of the day, you can very easily forget to leave this on. Whereas if it's flashing, it may draw more attention to let you know. So as you can see, our temperature is coming up right now. It's at 37, going 38, and I can physically feel the bed itself is starting to warm up. That's as far as the extent of the testing I'm going to do on that right now. I'm not going to bring it fully up to temperature because I'm going to be sitting with a big hot plate next to me. So we'll turn that one off. Our temperature will continue to read, and it will continue to show as the temperature drops. We now know our heater control works. We're letting our bed cool down a little bit. We're just going to flip on our control box in the back. You should see your screen boot up with the Duet Wi-Fi logo, advanced 3D printing configuration. When you're at this point, don't hit auto home. You have not flashed firmware, you have not uploaded configuration files. The Duet Wi-Fi does not know which machine it's connected to. If you hit home right now, steppers may operate the wrong direction, limit switches may not be set up properly. It is possible to do damage to your machine at this point, so don't attempt to do it. Follow the process, it does work. So first, when you boot up the Duet Wi-Fi, it's going to report an error message that says the Wi-Fi module cannot find any networks. I am idle. That is normal at this point. It's basically telling you, I'm up and running, I'm trying to connect, but nothing is going right now. So let's dismiss that error message. At the bottom 4 buttons, there's one that says control, one that says print, console, and setup. For this, what we're going to do is go to console. In the upper right corner, there's a little keyboard icon, and we're essentially going to type in a command that is going to turn off the Wi-Fi module. You cannot add, remove, subtract, change networks while the Wi-Fi module is running, so you actually have to bring it down first then configure your startup file, and then when you bring it back up, it will read that file and properly connect to the network. So in your startup guide, it is going to tell you the command is M552 space S0. Now what that command basically is M552 is saying I'm talking to my Ethernet, wireless Ethernet port. I'm going to tell it to do an S0 or a stop or shut down or go to mode 0. So when you hit enter on that, it will not report any information on the console screen behind you. This is normal. By virtue of the fact that it is no longer reporting an error, tells you that the Wi-Fi module is down. When you go connect to your current network, the command for that is going to be M587. So M587 space. There is going to be S for the source of your network. You can put in a double quote and you can say network. End your quote. And then you can put in a capital P with a double quote again. Say your password. And end your quote. So your command will look something like that. It will start with M587, which is telling Duet to add the following network. The S is the SSID or the network identification name of your network, and the P is your network password. Once you enter this into this control box, you will not see it every time you boot. It will give you a status. I'm connected to the network, here's my IP address. So bear with me for one moment. I will be right back with a connected network. All right, so now that we have our user ID and password put into our network, if you go back to your console, it actually says connected Wi-Fi module connected to access point, office IP address. And if you want to double check that, you want to make sure that you have local connection from your laptop to your printer. So the simplest way to do it is just open a command prompt and use a ping command. Make sure that you can ping the printer. If you can't ping it, you won't be able to use the Duet web interface to be able to control it. So it's just a quick test. Everything basic you can do off this screen. This is more for preheat, kind of looking at the status of your machine, where are you at, turn your LEDs on and off, move your head to the front. When we come back, our next segment, I'm going to be working on the laptop. I'm going to be flashing firmware, uploading the custom macros, all that for this machine. And then when we come back again to visit the machine, we'll actually be doing homing, checking all of our axes motors, showing some of the nice macros that Modix has built into the Duet Wi-Fi configuration. So when we see you again, we'll be doing our firmware and then we'll come back here shortly.